done with looking at the challenges. It's time to look at the positives. I am so excited for Dr. Tom Nicholson, and this is unpublished material, so he has analysed over 10,000 different ADHD papers, looking and filtering for those that talk about the positive aspects, and then going through looking for the credibility of them and the analysis, and has provably identified aspects of ADHD that provide the positive. We've talked about the challenge. We want to talk about the positive. And can't tell you, honestly, when he told me that he'd done this, like, I nearly fell off my chair. It's like, we've been needing this. And he actually then said, actually, I did it a little while ago. And life got ahead. And so he's actually, for this conference, then updated everything he's done. So I'm very, very excited for this. So without further ado, Dr. Tom Nicholson.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
We can.
Marvelous. Thanks for having us. Yeah. Going to be talking about the positives of ADHD, very much from that research perspective as well, about what evidence do we have about the positive aspects of ADHD, ADHD traits, ADHD symptoms, and what can we gain from the evidence that we have to move forward in a way that's going to be helpful.
And that's very important, right? This is research-based. This isn't flimmy-flam, like just chitty-chatter. Oh, I once saw someone with ADHD and they super did a good thing. This is like data. And
that's what I'm trying.
I'm handing over to you. Here come your slides.
Marvelous. We have a slide. Really quickly, just on a sort of offshoot, I heard you mention, Henry, about diabetes and ADHD. I'm actually in conversations with the Royal College of Nursing looking at updating our advice and guidance and giving some guidance for staff on ADHD and diabetes and how to manage diabetes when you have ADHD, how to give support, because a lot of our diabetic specialist nurses are also wanting information and advice on how to better support those with things like diet control, things like remembering to take your insulin and how to approach your insulin and things like that. So just a little offshoot of one of the other projects that's going on at the moment.
And Dr. Tom Nicholson, he has ADHD. He's passionately changed his career into, I always feel slightly wrong to say it, but like focused on ADHD. It's the focus bit. It just, you don't feel like, so, but like that's what he's doing. And honestly, diabetes, it scares I really, really like sweets. I have 50 now and I've liked them for a long time. And, obviously issues on diet for people with ADHD, very, very significant. Serious issues around obesity, around impulse eating, like the big problems. Honestly, when I look at diabetes, you do kind of think, why isn't an ADHD person automatically given automatic monitoring? Because I mean, why? That just seems, we have an obvious solution that will make a very, very big difference for our community. And thinking about those kind of things, I've certainly had medication like where I've mucked it up and I've just gone.
Well, maybe next year, that'll be our topic for next year. Might have a little look at that. We might be somewhere.
That sounds good, because we've been talking to the main diabetes charity, and we want to do something with it. So perfect, right? Positives.
Let's get out of this ADHD tangent already. As has already been said, I have ADHD myself, so I'm going to try and keep to time as best we can and talk about one of the projects I've been part of a few years ago and how we're trying to reinvigorate that project now. And the project was called the Positive ADHD Project. What we were really interested in, it was exploring what are the research-based evidence of ADHD traits. Now, who am I and why am I someone who might have some things to say in this topic? As I've been introduced, my name is Dr. Tom Nicholson. I am an assistant professor of mental health nursing at Northumbria University. That's one of the jobs that I hold. I also have my own ADHD training business where I deliver neuro-inclusion training in healthcare, educational environments and social care environments on how to best support neurodivergent staff, students, stakeholders, patients, whoever's part of your organization. So I'm an academic. My PhD was on the experiences of parents across the ADHD diagnostic journey. What's it like to be a parent? What experiences do you have? How did the story of your children change over that waiting list, that receiving the diagnosis, and then post-diagnosis, and then also how do your story of yourself as a parent change as well? How do those stories form and then adapt when we interact with systems? So that's one of the areas I'm interested in, is parenting. I'm interested in the gifted experience of ADHD for gifted ADHDers or gifted neurodivergent people, and as well positives and how we frame ADHD in society. Prior to being an academic, I was a mental health nurse in a neurodevelopmental assessment service in Newcastle and Gateshead. And prior to, as a mental health, as an assessor and delivering intervention for ADHD. And I use the term intervention lightly because, as has already been discussed, intervention is shaky and inconsistent sort of nationally. Prior to this, I was diagnosed with ADHD at 5 years old. I'm ADHD autistic. I have had that label my entire life. I have been medicated as a child, had a period of 20 years unmedicated, and been medicated again as an adult. And so come from a sort of patient-led experience, service expert by experience, as well as that clinical and academic perspective. I'm going to talk about positives today. And the reason why I include this picture on the right here is one of the positives that I find personally about being more impulsive than the average person. I was on holiday in Vietnam, and I was with my wife and my friends, and I turned to my wife. We'd been there for 10 days, and I said to her, "Darling, should we go somewhere else? We've been here for 10 days. Should we go somewhere else?" And she was like, "Well, what are you talking about?" So I got my phone, looked at Google Maps, saw that Borneo was nearby, so we flew to Borneo. And then we spent a 6-hour jungle trek in Borneo the next day. That's not typical. That's an unusual thing to do, but that is evidence of impulsivity and being able to live in chaos and spontaneity in a way that when you have the scaffolding and support to allow for it, you get some incredible life experiences. And that's part of the thinking that I had around this positive ADHD project. I don't hear a lot of people talking about that in the research world. So the question becomes, what are the narratives around positivity in ADHD? Because what we've got to be really careful of is to not go to that Pollyanna perspective of ADHD is purely a superpower and everything about it is positive, when we have the statistics that we've talked about already today of in interactions with the criminal justice system, increased rate of suicidality, poorer mental health, and lived experience of difficulty and impairment. And this talk is in no way meant to delegitimize or devalue or invalidate the experiences that many might have of difficulty and shame and challenge, but to also give people a different language or alternative language of what can we gain from the research about positives. But I'm also going to problematize that a little bit and talk about some of the difficulties in that research. So that's the context for our project. I did this project with a wonderful psychologist called Dr. Laura Coulthard, and what we were interested in was doing some research. And this was one of the problems when you are a neurodivergent ADHDer doing research. Life events happen. I was doing a PhD at the time. This project was because I was interested in doing it on the side of my PhD. And that's one of the things that can be really tricky in academia, is having multiple projects at the same time, which is why this project is currently unpublished. And I'm really pushing myself to now get this published over the next year or so. I was moving house, and then COVID happened and lockdown happened, and things changed in the research world. At the beginning of every single meeting, Laura and I were getting together and going, "So where were we? We need to double check everything. We need to check what we were doing and what data we had. And then, did you read this paper or did I read those 5 papers?" And in line with that, we'd then not read each other's emails correctly, so things would get missed. And so this entire project was well over a year, when with our ADHD brains, we probably could have done it a bit more streamlined. And then the biggest issue of this project was that we didn't actually write it up because of those other life events. I had a son, and the newborn phase made it that the idea of writing a systematic review up became insurmountable. So give ourselves some grace is one of the messages of this, is we all have difficulties at times, and sometimes they manifest in different ways. So this systematic review, how did we try to explore the positives? We wanted to identify any evidence in any research on ADHD which included a positive reference to living with ADHD traits or symptoms. So really broad and open. Now, because this was a broad and open question, and we looked at 7 large databases of research, we ended up coming back with about 15,800 articles. This was naturally massive undertaking. So some of those articles we could sort of discount just based on title. Some of those we could discount based on the abstract. And that took a good chunk of time to truly discount as many thousands of those as we could. And one of the unfortunate realities that came out was that only 36 research papers at that time were included for our analysis, our deep dive analysis, because only 36 research papers in 2001 truly had any strong connection with positive ADHD traits. This meant that 1 in every 1,300 papers specifically asked a question about positives. And this is one of those problems that I'm going to bring up in the ADHD research when we're talking about positives, is that historically, we haven't even asked the question about what the positives might be. Most of the researchers looked at, how do you struggle? What are your lived experience of impairment? What is hard about living with ADHD? What's the worst things? How do you fail academically? But not, what's the best thing about having ADHD? Where do you feel like your strengths lie? So that sort of historic lack of questioning about positives of ADHD has led to a situation where in the research, we didn't have a lot of discussion about positives. We didn't have loads of truly robust evidence that we could use to answer this question, which is one of the core problems. But answer that question, we certainly tried. What did we find? What positives did come out and are now continuing to come out in research as it has emerged since 2020, 2021? One of the core themes that we found in our research with ADHD and ADHD traits is so many people talked about energy and speed as a positive. They talked about the fact that because they have ADHD, because they're more hyperactive, they're more hyperkinetic thinkers, they were more spontaneous. And that spontaneity allows us to act quickly, think fast, and respond in ways and jump on opportunities in ways that other people may not. A lot of us are described as quick thinkers, quick on our feet. One of the reasons why we might see a lot of people with ADHD is in comedy is because of that quick-witted, quick thinking, divergent, bouncing off the wall thinking that allows them to respond in action with less preparation. And this quickness goes into other areas as well from a physical perspective, having a benefit in sports and a benefit in sort of what they call high scan variable attention. So being able to look around at different threats and what might be happening in the game, and then respond more quickly or impulsively or hyperactively in a way that gives you a competitive edge. There are also some evidence for high pressure environments, thinking about sort of high tension, high pressure environments in the police, in healthcare, in academia, in delivering conference presentations to thousands of people. These links also come with high energy just generally, and how that can link to academic performance, being able to train harder, faster, longer than others, or at least feeling like they are able to. And a lot of people talked about the feeling of hyperactivity or hyperkinesis feeling quite positive when not being stifled by society and societal expectations, and being able to live that hyperactivity in your environment. So being in a work environment when you can walk around and do what you want and stand up, that being quite a positive experience for some people. When we go from, and then finally being a skilled multitasker, being able, and this is one of those interesting things that a lot of the psychological research would argue that, so the psychology research, that people with ADHD are poorer at multitasking. But when you ask people with ADHD, they consider themselves to be quite good at multitasking, depending on what those tasks are and depending on the different sort of cognitive loads, what they're doing sort of multiple really high executive functioning complex tasks might not be the best place for them, but being able to have a conversation while watching the telly, while doing something else, feeling more skilled in sort of those more low executive functioning related tasks. From energy and speed, we move on to creativity. There's a lot being talked about in creativity and ADHD right now. And I think what we have to be mindful of is looking at what do we mean by the term creativity? Because the research evidence that came out was that people describe being more creative, increased creativity, both in an artistry perspective, so, the arts and cultural perspective, but also in that divergent thinking, being able to think outside of the box, not just being sort of trapped in linear, one-dimensional thought processes, but being able to think of ideas that end up making £1 million. These are why we see Silicon Valley large organizations specifically scouting neurodivergent talent for that out-of-the-box, non-linear, divergent thinking, which might be a major sort of breakout thought leader approach, which is incredible when that is nourished and supported. A lot of people talked about, ADHD allows you to see the world differently. And when you see the world differently, you can approach the world differently. Now, this can become problematic in some areas, especially in some social contexts, but being able to see the world differently can allow you to respond to it differently and challenge some of those social norms. And I'll come back on that topic later. I really like this one, this idea that mind wandering is a problematic symptom of ADHD, is a disabling, impairment, pairing symptom. And it absolutely can be. However, mind wandering, daydreaming, is often a requirement for novel thought, for creative new thought. We often talk about how our best ideas are found when we're in the shower, when we're driving, when we're doing something else. Well, a lot of people with ADHD often feel like they're often doing something else. And if you're in an environment or a job or a position where you are allowed to do that, academia being one, the creative arts being one, being a writer, being a comic book strip artist, in those situations, being a musician, that mind wandering can be beneficial and a strength. As an incredible speaker once said to me, it's about curiosity. It was Ned Hallowell. The mind does not go empty, it goes elsewhere. This idea that people with ADHD have these sort of like blank brains, are filled with fuzz. Often it's just elsewhere. It's not on the topic that's being requested of them by society at that time. From creativity, we found another strong theme of resilience. And I really love this one, of this idea that people with ADHD have increased levels of determination. I think in part because we've often had to fight a lot of fights. We've had to push against a lot of societal struggles. I think this is particularly relevant looking back at Atif Chowdhury's wonderful talk earlier about how when you add an intersectional lens to this, a racial lens to this, a gendered lens to this becomes an even greater potential strength if allowed to heal and grow in a way that is not crushing and overwhelming. Go back to that higher tolerance for chaos and ambiguity. Because many of us are more effective in chaotic environments or high stress environments, varied environments where every day is different, you see more ADHDers in places like the police, nursing, teaching, public speaking, places where every day is different and there is an expectation for you to always be on your toes and thinking on your feet. That's where you see more of us. Again, thinking about what other types of roles come in mind for the audience members, like, is your role one of those? One of the other big findings was being different as a positive. This belief that being told that we're different as if it's a negative, problematized thing, but retaking that language and turning that into a positive of, actually, many people see ADHD as a personality enhancer. It makes them different, unique. It makes them unusual. It makes them odd. It makes them vibrant. It makes them exciting. A lot of parents I would speak to would say that my children are never boring. My life is never boring. And that it can be draining and overwhelming, but certainly not boring. And our ADHDers, our neurodivergent people, are more likely to combat those social norms. More likely, I'm curious about some research evidence and doing a project looking at whether people with ADHD are more likely to be involved in social justice movements, such as things like Black Lives Matter, the LGBTQ plus movement, or veganism, and whether those who have been unfairly treated by society, ADHDers, are more likely to fight for others. ADHD makes you an individual. That there's some power in that. More fun. One word that came up quite often, which I thought was interesting, was bubbly. A bubbly personality. And for parents who are neurodivergent, who have ADHD, there's some emerging evidence that having an ADHD child and having ADHD yourself increases parental ability, i.e. it improves your resilience, your problem solving, your levels of maturity, your communication, assuming that things aren't too difficult and too challenging. If you are pushed in that sort of zone of proximal development, that place where it's not too hard, but it's hard, you end up developing really unique skills that can make you a stronger parent in some of these areas. There's some discussion around empathy, and I've heard a couple of things about the criminal justice system today already, and some emerging evidence that, and we found some evidence that those with ADHD have increased empathy, or at least feel like they have increased empathy, but that empathy may not look the same as it does for everyone else. We might be very highly social and really aware of people's difficulties, but getting it wrong in that social situation. So struggling with things like friendships, but deeply wanting and needing them, and being a linchpin friend for your friend group. Having a greater awareness of those bigger picture issues linking back to our social justice movements. And as I've said earlier, I'm curious, is there an increased likelihood of involvement? We don't fully know that yet. We need more evidence. We need more research on this topic. So if there's any academics in the room, give me a shout. I'd be curious to look at some projects on this area. We talk a lot about risk-taking in ADHD, impulsivity being connected or with this idea of risk-taking. And very often certainly in healthcare, when we talk about risk-taking, it's done with this air of problem, of something that we want to avoid. People with ADHD take more risks. They use more substances. They're more likely to be in a car accident. They're more likely to take a risk that leads them to financial strain. And that is true, and we can't deny that. But on the flip side of that is positive risk-taking, increased impulsivity leading us to take risks that societally are seen as positive. What is a positive risk in society? Well, entrepreneurialism and entrepreneurship, where there's a huge now growing body of evidence in ADHD and entrepreneurialism and entrepreneurship. People with ADHD are more likely to be self-employed. They're more likely than average. They are more likely to be business owners, and they're more likely to own multiple business. I think it not unexpected that many of the speakers today who have had careers or have careers are also business owners, CEOs. They are thought leaders. These are the types of places, and these are the type of things that we do. But it doesn't have to be at this big sort of conceptual conference academic-y level. Business owning in ADHD can be opening up your coffee business in a coffee cart in a market. That is risk taking. Doing something that you really love, opening up a plushie store, opening up a vegan bakery, like. Risk and ADHD go hand in hand, but what we need to be mindful of and cognizant of is the contextual risk and the scaffolding of risk. So taking a risk is safer for some people than it is for others. Opening your own business is safer for someone who has other forms of financial security than those who do not. And that's why you would see things like access to work and other forms of governmental funding being able to supporting ADHD business owners or disabled business owners, with the acknowledgement that if you have these diagnoses or these conditions, you face additional barriers that are non-normative, so to speak. This idea of impulsively changing your career for greater fulfillment, just leaving your job without fully thinking through why, but not putting up with and taking a dissatisfying life or a dissatisfying situation or social situation. And this idea of $1 million or £1 million ideas. We talk a lot about our truly exceptional billionaire, millionaire ADHDers, and there is absolutely a place for that. But we also have to recognize there's a lot of privilege in those places. And I love what Atif said earlier about what about those leaders, those wonderful individuals who aren't in a position of sort of visibility, but are still brilliant in their families, brilliant in their communities, brilliant in their clubs and their sport clubs, and they're supporting the people around them, but not on the cover of a magazine or plastered all over social media. I love this. This is probably my favorite theme. This idea, we talk a lot about sort of fixed interests, specialist interests, and that being more of an autistic trait, and yet so many ADHDers experience this acute passion and enthusiasm for your specific interest. What I've put on here is the amount of pages that I have read over since 2013, because one of my specialist interests is reading. I absolutely adore books. I've got tattoos of books on my arms. You'll notice the little dip in the middle from sort of 2017 to 2021. That was doing a PhD. That kind of gets in the way of your reading a little bit, but typically I would read around about 51 to sort of 75 books, to 52 to 75 books a year. I'm on track with about 49 right now. I'm reading Moby Dick right now, as you do. So when you have this acute passion and enthusiasm for your specific interest, that leads to having a good memory for the things that interest you. How many of your ADHD children and ADHD friends can list every single character of their favorite anime or cartoon or dinosaur? Or how many have really good knowledge of the video game that they're playing at that moment, or their favorite wrestlers, or their show? Almost at an unusual, atypical level, like real deep memories, real deep thought processes, being really good at those things that interest them, being excellent at those things that interest them, because you're more able to put in so much extra time, because you almost can't get enough of it. You can't get enough of the thing that interests you. So you just keep doing it and keep doing it, and you do it more than the average person. And we see these high levels of enthusiasm for the thing that interests them. Now, I know Atif as well talked about like our capitalistic society, and how if the thing that interests you is something that is sort of can earn you money, well, then that becomes something that we cherish and we support and we love, and we go, oh, brilliant, you're going to be a mathematician, you're going to be this, you're going to be an engineer, you're going to be brilliant. But also, what about those who are just exceptional at things that, and incredibly passionate about things that are not money makers or production makers, but create joy and create love and create sort of passion for our people, for everyone. And we often talk about hyperfocus as sort of over-focused attention, and hyperfocus being a positive, being able to be highly productive. I know that I'm talking myself as an academic, talking about robust evidence-based things, but thinking about my own personal experience, during my PhD, when I'm writing, I would be incredibly productive for an hour at midnight, and I would get so much work done in that 1 hour that others might struggle to do for 3 or 4 hours. And then I'd need to not look at it for a day. So I'd have these ebbs and flows of hyperfocus. And when you can channel and utilize that hyperfocus on a thing that is of interest to you, that is also helpful to you, it can be just a wonderful sort of matching of what you want and then what is wanted of you by society, whether that be your job or your family. But also recognizing that you can't hyperfocus all the time, and that leads to things like burnout. So we need to be mindful of that. And as I've just said, that linking to high productivity. But what does productivity look like? If an organization or a job role requires you to, for instance, write down all of your projects and write down in sort of narrative text form, prose form, your findings, that you might appear to be very unproductive. You might appear to be really slow at your job and really struggle with your job because you struggle with the act of transferring your thoughts to the written word. But if you were allowed to talk it out, if you're allowed to use software that allows you to sort of speech to text software, then suddenly that productivity skyrockets. This idea of, taking ADHD children and putting them in things like forest schools and teaching them not in a classroom, but in a different environment. And suddenly their production shoots up because we're teaching them in a way that is relevant and salient and interesting to them. Then we see what are typical measures of educational success at a higher rate? There are, of course, problems with that, but the research isn't necessarily talking about that just yet. So from there, when I spoke to Henry, he said to me, this is an incredible project. You did it up until 2020. Wow, when are you going to publish it? And I said to him, it's a bit out of date now. It's been 4 years since then. So I suppose I should probably start updating it. So I started updating this research, and I've started some of this work. It's certainly not finished, but I pulled out some really salient papers and some really salient points, some really sort of vital bits of research that have been done since 2020 to see what's happening now. How have things changed in the last 4 years? Because they have changed in the research. It's wonderful. We are seeing significantly more research papers specifically asking about positives, specifically having a question in their interview schedules, their topic guides, their questionnaires with a positive slant to them. And even more exciting, we are seeing papers specifically focusing on positives as the primary purpose. And some examples of that, we've got Ramji and Foster in 2023 talked about the strengths of ADHD in university students. Charabin et al. Talking about this paper, I'm Doing Okay, the strengths and resilience of children with and without ADHD. And Shippers et al. Talking about a qualitative and quantitative study of self-reported positive characteristics of individuals with ADHD. When the words strengths and positives are in the title of a paper, it makes me so excited because we saw so few of them only 4 years ago. And now there are lists of them. Things are changing, and I think that's really cool. I think that's really awesome that the research world is catching up with the narratives and the language that's being used in the charitable sector and social media, in the sort of what we call lay public, the general public perspective of these things. And I think what we have to be careful is continue to have that measured approach in the research, and that measured approach of what is actually about the ADHD and what are just personality traits, what is independent of the ADHD that are strengths of individuals. Maybe for some people that ADHD symptom was an impairment or a difficulty and not a strength, and for someone else it might be. So these papers, I'm going to go through them just quite quickly. What did they find? Courage was one of the findings. This adventurousness, this justice, nonconformist, proactive, integrity. These themes came up in our review, but continue in the research now. Humanity, our theme was empathy, but humanity, kindness, love, social intelligence, and need to seek self-actualization. This idea that seeking a diagnosis helps us to seek a way to conceptualize and understand ourselves as we are not an abnormal neurotypical, we are a normal neuroatypical. That's one of the lines in one of these papers. Now, there are some difficulties and some problems with the language of neurotypical versus neuroatypical, neurodivergent, non-neurodivergent. But fundamentally, people are looking for language that helps them to understand themselves. I've been using the wrong metric to judge myself for so long. And that's what we see a lot in our adults who are late diagnosed. Vitality, again, we said energy and speed. Vitality, it's showing up consistently. Cognitive dynamism, the ability to think on your feet, think quickly. And with that wisdom and knowledge, creativity comes back in again, but from a cognitive, intellectual perspective, a love of learning. In one of the other papers, one of the things that I found really interesting in Charabin's paper, which was that they looked at the resilience scores and how the self-reported strength scores of children with ADHD and children without ADHD. And what they found was a total lack of difference between those children. Actually, this idea that this belief that ADHD children have much lower resilience, they see themselves as having less strengths, they didn't necessarily find that. Children with ADHD are typically doing just as well as children without ADHD in terms of their self-reported strength and resilience. Some of that language is getting through to our young people now. Some of the language of this is not just the disability-focused, impaired-focused, you are the problem, you need to conform, is not quite as strong as it was perhaps when I was in education and really had a challenging educational journey in early education. They also said, which is what I said at the start of this talk, that deficit-focused research has contributed to this negative perspective on ADHD within the community, the research and the healthcare and the educational community. When all of your research talks about how bad it is to have ADHD, it's really blooming hard for people to feel good about it. And it's really hard for academics and psychiatrists and psychologists and teachers to believe in some of the positives they're saying, because they don't have the evidence to do so. They don't have the real research evidence to back that up. They just have what they're reading in newspapers, etc. In the final paper, those same topics come up. Creativity, being dynamic, being high energy. This idea of novelty seeking. Now, novelty seeking can be a problem when that novelty comes from dopamine experiences, high dopamine experiences, such as substance use or alcohol use. But it becomes a wonderful life experience when that novelty seeking means that our ADHDers, we're more likely to be motocross riders and more likely to work in Red Bull, and they're more likely to be in extreme sports and skateboarding and high diving. As an example, I've been bungee jumping, I've been skydiving. My poor mum is constantly scared for my well-being, because that thrill seeking is to such a higher level than average. And again, talking not about every person with ADHD, but certainly for many of us, that idea to seek novelty, seek excitement. What is the next best thing, the next most exciting thing? That can lead to some wonderful experiences and to some really sort of well-rounded individuals who have traveled not just the geographic world, but the sort of intellectual world. This isn't just about learning, it's about exploring. Flexibility, they found, it comes back to those same topics: speed, spontaneity, being open-minded, being pro-social, these socio-affective skills, being empathic. And one of the things that comes up quite often in our increased empathy discussion around ADHD is, yes, we have that sort of human-to-human empathy, that idea of being mindful and caring about bigger picture concepts, about social justice concepts, but also empathy towards, certainly from children, younger children, empathy towards those who are not on the same, seen as peers, but those who are seen as more vulnerable. Pro-social behavior towards animals. This idea of children with ADHD absolutely adoring their pets. I think one of the aspects of that that's important is, we talk about man's best friend, this idea of what do dogs never do? Or what do animals never do? Well, they never judge you. And that allows for love and true sort of empathy to flourish, cross-species almost. This idea of higher order cognitive skills, hyper-focus, being analytical, being a quick learner, if taught correctly. And that's one of the things that we also need to bear in mind, is these potential strengths, they exist and they are real and they can be life-affirming and life-changing. But what we really need to ensure we do as a society is nurture them, because it's really hard to see someone's strengths when we are constantly telling someone how crap they are at other things, how bad they are at this, how much they fail at this, how their symptoms are a problem for everybody else, how they cause disruption in classrooms. When we focus on those things, those potential strengths get masked and hidden. And like those researchers who were never looking for those strengths, as parents, as professionals, as clinicians, we stop seeing those strengths and stop the potential of seeing those strengths, because we're looking at those difficulties and those problems, and they are clouding our views. So we need to be open-minded with this without being overly optimistic and denying the real lived experiences of difficulty and of challenge. And I want to just sort of come to a gentle end for the potential of some questions of that. If we don't look for any positives, we won't find them. if we are not looking for a different way of thinking about these things, we will not find it. And I want to touch very lightly on my experience, and that I describe my early life as attachment focused and loving and supporting from my family, and institutionally abusive and traumatic from an educational perspective. This idea that, even with a diagnosis, being told that you are the problem by education, so often being told that I was a poor learner, that I couldn't be taught, that I shouldn't be in school, that I'm not right for school. And then when I was 15 years old, being recognized as gifted and talented by a wonderful set of teachers, Mr. McGowan, Mrs. Wright, and Mr. Spurs, recognizing that actually I had some amazing strengths in my academic ability, but that had been ignored and hidden for 15 years. And because it was clouded by this idea of how much of a problem I was. And I want to end on this idea of stories. And the story around ADHD in the research has been one of deficit for so long. That is changing. The story of ADHD in society is also changing in nuanced and complicated ways. And I think we, as a group of however many thousand people are here, have the ability to alter and adjust that story and start looking at positives. And I'd like us to start changing that story. Because my story very easily could have been one like what we've heard of earlier, of failure and of struggle. And yet my ADHD related strengths and the sort of unconditional love of my family and the wonderful alternative stories that were given to me by teachers of being good at some things, that is what changed my story. It was individuals, it wasn't systems. And I'm happy to end off there if there are any questions.
Hello. I'm sure there are. I'll give a quick update on our current cumulative live viewers. 19,074. I have a little eye thing at the top which tells me that. I have to be completely honest, I'm not quite sure if it's 19,000 is our total that have come to see, or 19,000 current. I'm suspicious, but regardless, it's a fantastic number. And I loved that. Exactly what was needed on the and it's a very, very powerful point at the end where you talk about if we only look for negatives, that's all we're going to find. We need this, and we do, and it's brilliant. It's brilliant work. Like, can't you get 2 PhDs? Surely that's worth another PhD. Can't you be Doctor?
There's one of the things that I would say is doing a PhD with ADHD. Myself and a number of colleagues have done it, and I know I've spoke to now dozens of people. It's a really interesting journey in itself. There are some unique challenges and some wonderfully unique benefits that come from doing a PhD. And one of the things that I think is really fascinating, and I am going to touch on this, was that in education, we are bombarded with what we need to know at what time. Geography at 10 o'clock, maths at 11 o'clock, humanities at 12. We have to do a certain thing at a certain time, and you need to always be learning. And there is no real time in the typical educational journey for creativity, for you to just think and act and be. And yet you get to PhD level, and when you're doing a doctoral thesis where the expectation is that you make an original contribution to knowledge, you bring something that has never been seen in sort of research before. That's what a PhD, the expectation of a PhD is. And you get 3 or 5 years to do that. You are told and expected to put time in your diary to think, to be, to have a coffee and have a chat with other people, to explore, to go down rabbit holes of research that you think you're going to be writing about. And you do that for 3 months and you write thousands of words on what you think is going to be really integral. And then you throw it all away because actually it turned out it wasn't. But that tangent that you went down is expanding your sort of intellectual horizons. It's developing your intellectual ability. That's expected, but we don't get that freedom until doctoral level. Not really. And that's often felt quite backwards to me, that we should have that freedom all the way through. And that freedom might look very different for the child with ADHD who ends up becoming a world-class comedian, because ADHD is overrepresented in comedy and in sort of professional comics. And where in your educational journey until 18 do you have the ability to celebrate, not just celebrate, but develop your comedy skills, to develop your ability to be a comedian, to be on stage that isn't just drama? And we don't celebrate the types of roles and skills that we see so many, and we don't nurture them, that we see so many ADHDs going into and neurodivergent people going into. There's these ideas of, where do we develop the skills of being a YouTuber or a content creator or an athlete, but in a non-normative sport? In the UK, it's football predominantly, or tennis. In other countries, the dominant sport is something else. But what about chess? What about Warhammer? What about being a dungeon master in Dungeons and Dragons? What about being a short story writer? What about doing comic book strips? What about being a barista? What about all these different ways in which our ADHD our strengths and interests can be nourished, that isn't just the standardized educational perspective of what we need to know by a certain time, because you're allowed to do that. That was sort of, I hate to use this term, these like sort of upper echelons of education. In academia, that's celebrated, but in first school, that's punished. Anyway,
it's a big point, and actually, someone has commented in put a comment in saying, Stuart saying, I eventually got a joint honours degree but failed my A levels the first time around. Like,
yeah, we see this so quite often, because in education, well, we see a couple of things. One thing that we see is people being less likely to get into university when they have ADHD, and people being more likely to drop out in the first year. Now,
I had a conversation with the head of disability in one. Sorry to talk. In the head of disability in one of the Russell Group, and they talked exactly your point just then of lots of people diagnosed in the first year and looking to get support, or realizing they had ADHD because the scaffolding is no longer there from school, particularly parents and the structure of school, and suddenly they're struggling, they're expected to do a lot and they don't have any of the instructors to do it. I asked them, what do you do? And they said, what do you do with the kids who come to you already with a diagnosis of ADHD that know? And it was a devastating answer. The answer was, we don't get many of those.
Mm-hmm. And
your point again.
Well, one of the things that I've been doing in this space, because this is something I'm really passionate about, working in higher education, is I've developed the role of a neurodiversity champion for equality, diversity and inclusion within nursing and midwifery, and to look at how can we better support neurodivergent students and neurodivergent pupils and staff, especially considering those who may not have a diagnosis or who may be seeking a diagnosis. We talked a lot about diagnostic rates and wait times in this conference, and how you might have a student in first year who we think might have ADHD, and then they're told, well, you might get a diagnosis in 3 to 5 years. Their degree's finished by that point. So how can we, as universities, as educational institutes, how can we support those people without needing labels? And we should be able to do that, and we can do that. But one of the things that requires is knowledge and education of ourselves as academics as well. Not everyone has the sort of knowledge that I have, or like peers that have in mental health nursing. When you think about, as a mathematics academic or a geographer or an ancient history lecturer, you might never have come abreast of ADHD as a concept really in your life. So we need to support academics to be able to support our students.
We do. We had, there was an incident about, must be now about a year ago, the GP at Cambridge University decided to write an op-ed in one of the newspapers saying that too many students at Cambridge were getting an ADHD diagnosis. And the main reason she thought that was happening was so that people could not have to take their exam in the main hall. And I believe that was her main grudge. Just like, of all the things to get annoyed about, because sometimes people go, well, it's not like that in, these adjustments like exams, like you don't get that in real life in the workplace. And people need to understand that there are workplace adjustments, and you do get things in real life. And two, I think you'll find that an exam hall isn't exactly a great proxy for the business environment.
Any form of professional environment at all. Yeah.
And the Great Hall at Cambridge, the least, how many people are going to medieval halls to do their daily work? It's just such a ridiculous premise. We worked with some students to create a response to go in. This person didn't work at the university, but was influential, was on some of the boards. And we said, Cambridge has been home to an extraordinary diversity of minds over centuries. And that diversity of mind and diversity of thought is what has made Cambridge and has made many other universities famous. And we should celebrate that Cambridge itself is working to have a wider neurodiversity of minds and wider diversity of ideas, because that is where the future of new ideas. And that's not saying that ideas come from neurodiversity, it's just saying, and neurodivergence, it's just saying that a diversity of minds, that's how you get new ideas. That's the whole.
And as I said earlier, I've spoken to so many PhDs, so many professors with ADHD, so many that are coming out of the sort of woodwork, so to speak, and talking openly, because we have forums for that now. We have sort of an acknowledgement that we exist in academia. We exist, and we have always existed, but now we exist much more openly, and we talk about it much more openly, which is a wonderful step in the right direction.
Survivors, though, right? It's the ones who weren't able also to get through, and I know that's one of your passion points, is getting that support to people who are struggling. Right, you've got fans. I'm on in some of the comments. It's funny to hear Tom's story, so similar to mine. And people talking about how fantastic you are and how wonderful the presentation was.
Thank you.
Just delight. We've had someone asking about any known links between ADHD and empathy, like people talking about how they feel that, well, particularly link of ADHD and social justice. Do you see it as a positive or a negative? These are definitely double-edged swords.
I agree. I think it could. We don't know for certain exactly why that might be happening. I suspect there may be an element of, when you are neurodivergent, you have often faced quite a lot of adversity in society's systems and institutional spheres, whether that be healthcare, education, the criminal justice system, whether that be in your culture, in your communities. And so often those who have faced a lot of adversity get this sort of sensitized perspective of justice, and this really strong sense of justice, of fairness. Now you add in something like sort of quite cognitively rigid thinking that you might see from someone who's neurodivergent, perhaps or more sort of on the autism spectrum, and you see clear paths of this isn't fair, and things that aren't fair are not okay, so we need to do something about that. And it becomes almost like simple. You just have to do something about it. And the sort of social barriers to supporting social justice movements become less obvious to you or less important to you, because the deep sense of unfairness and justice, it allows us a way to I often don't like using language that's very sort of evocative of fighting, but like fight back. It allows us to take the pain that we have felt, take the challenges that we have faced, and turn that into something where we can make change for the better. One of my sort of core tenets to my entire approach is I wouldn't want any child to have the educational journey that I had, the early educational experiences. That's what sort of drives me. So to have that driving force, which like leads to everything I do today, which is wonderfully positive today, but to actually have that driving force was because of challenges and adversity that was faced earlier on in my life. So you're absolutely right. There is this double-edged sword to it of, is that justice sensitivity a byproduct of the injustice that we have faced, coupled with a more rigid sort of black and white thinking of how to respond to it? I'm not sure. I don't know. But that's certainly an area which would be fascinating to explore from multiple different perspectives: sociological, psychological, etc.
It is. You've been amazing. Like, we've hit the time. I'm trying to run rigorously to time. Experience tells me that if you're running a 24-hour continuous conference, if you go out of time, you're out of time forever. Like, it just gets worse and worse. And I have to hand over to ADHD Australia to like on schedule. You've been amazing. I thought that was really interesting. It was a great salve to talking about all the challenges and talking to the positives. I thank you for the work you've done. Thank you for updating it, for coming here, for doing this. It's absolutely spectacular. Thank you. I have to say goodbye.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you again.
Have a wonderful rest of the conference, and good luck to everyone in the audience.
Wish me luck. It's actually overachieved on quality content. So we've actually got 26 hours, I think. It's 26 and a half, I think. Let's see how I look tomorrow. Great. Thanks, Tom.
Coffee in. Right. See you later, Henry. Take care, everyone.